Life Isn't Binary, on being both, beyond, and in between. This book was written by Iantaffi and Meg-John Barker and was published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers in 2020. Thanks to this 4-book summary, you will be able to understand what it really means to have a binary mentality and learn more about binary issues, especially regarding sexuality and gender. You will also learn how to break free from a binary mindset. But first, let's take a look at the author's work and background. Iantaffi is an author, independent scholar, licensed marriage and family therapist, and former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy. They are the co-founder of Edge's Wellness Center, LLC, a group practice based in the Dakota and Anishinaabe territories of Minnesota. They also host the Gender Stories podcast and have held lectures in various states in the US, Canada, UK, Europe, and Australia. Meg-John Barker is the author of numerous well-known books on sex, gender, and relationships. Before becoming a full-time writer, they were an academic psychologist and UKCP, United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, and have been an accredited therapist for many years. They have published several academic articles on issues including bisexuality, consensual non-monogamy, sadomasochism, non-binary gender, and Buddhist mindfulness. They also co-founded the Psychology and Sexuality Journal and the activist research organisation Bi UK. And now for the summary of Life Isn't Binary, starting with the first key point. Inflexible binary categorization affects everyone. Binary thinking is part of Western culture. It is used as a way to make sense of the world and to try to understand the complexity of life. René Descartes first discussed the distinction between body and mind in his dualism philosophy, but over time this categorization became a way for people to impose their own values on others, especially in the colonial era, and to justify the superiority of one group of people over another, or of humans over nature. By dividing the world into us and them, we began to dehumanize ourselves and other people, and to regard the world we live in as our property. This led to a progressive disintegration of the relationship with our innermost self, with others, and with the planet. This may be the predominant worldview in the West, but it is certainly not the only one. Binary thinking is harmful when we talk about sexuality because it causes bisexual people to become invisible and suggests that some sexual experiences are more right or normal than others. It is harmful when we talk about gender because it supports and fuels discriminatory practices. And it is also detrimental to relationships, especially regarding monogamy versus non-monogamy and love versus friendship, because it favors one side over another. Our perception of the body is also based on a binary division between the mind and body, emotional and rational, positive and negative, which causes unwarranted stress in people who do not conform to mainstream standards. It is possible to overcome this polarizing mindset, but it is not easy because we are so used to seeing the world in this way and dividing everything into a binary pair. According to the authors, we have to be kind to ourselves, to pause at intervals throughout the day whenever we register ourselves thinking in binary, to acknowledge how much the binary pattern is an inherent part of our thought processes, and to be patient because reversing this pattern takes daily practice over a long period of time. It is also crucial that we embrace the complexity and chaos of the world. Journaling is a practical and useful way to start thinking in a non-binary way, as is slowing down at certain times of the day, taking time for walks, meditation, and creating daily rituals that inspire our creativity. Learning to be tolerant of ourselves and our imperfections is key to this process, because once we have achieved a state of self-awareness, we will no longer feel compelled to fit ourselves into a binary world, nor will we do so with others. The concept of bisexuality shows that there is more to sexuality than simply being gay or straight. The traditional way of categorizing human sexuality has always been either as gay or straight. Bisexuality, however, is now a very common term used to describe non-binary sexuality. According to recent statistics, a great deal of people identify as bisexual, many more than those who identify as gay. Bisexuals are the largest group within the LGBTQIA+ rainbow, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and others. Yet, bisexuals tend to be invisible in our society. If a person dates another person of the same sex, they are immediately defined as gay, while someone who dates another person of the opposite sex is seen as straight. Bisexuality is still met with prejudice in our society, with many people assuming that bisexuals are promiscuous and highly sexualized and rarely form stable relationships. This failure to recognize bisexuals fairly means that, as is the case with transgender people, they suffer more from depression and anxiety than gay or lesbian people and are more likely to attempt suicide. These conditions are all common to people who feel marginalized by the society in which they live. In recent years, the media has gradually started to show a more realistic portrayal of bisexual people, but many common stereotypes and sayings unfortunately still label them in a false and negative way. Many people assume, for example, that bisexuality is just a phase, and it is often put down to the typical sexual experimentation that occurs during adolescence. Bisexuality is often also considered as immature and selfish, or a result of someone simply not being able to make up their minds. When bisexuality is then broken down by gender, the stereotypes increase even further. A bisexual woman is seen as sexually promiscuous, out of control, selfish, an nymphomaniac, and so on. If we also add the stigma of skin color, a bisexual black woman becomes a mere sex object who can be taken without asking for consent. A bisexual man, on the other hand, is seen as dangerous because he may be carrying diseases as a result of his supposed promiscuity. Bisexual black men are perceived to be even more dangerous, especially to white women, because of the mistaken belief that black men are less likely to reveal their bisexuality than white men. In order to break free from this mindset, we need to understand what sexuality really means. Let's start with the concept of sexual identity, which is a set of labels that each of us uses to define our own sexuality. There tend to be 3 labels: gay, hetero, or bisexual. It is important to remember, however, that these terms may not include our sexual behavior. In other words, what we actually do sexually or our sexual attraction, meaning who we are interested in on an erotic level. There is also something called sexual fluidity, which is the idea that our sexual identity, sexual behavior, and sexual attraction can change over time. In one of her studies, Lisa Diamond, the author of Sexual Fluidity, found that out of a sample of 100 women who were attracted to people of the same sex, 2/3 changed their sexual identity at least once over a 10-year period. This happened in every direction, from lesbian to bisexual, from bisexual to heterosexual, from unlabeled to gay, and so on. Diamond also found that the sexual identity of these women corresponded to the gender of their partners at the time, whether they were sexual partners or life partners. This suggests that people are more likely to adapt their sexual attraction to a specific person rather than to a whole gender category. Research by Jane Ward, author of Not Gay: Sex Between Straight White Men, has shown that it is very common for men who identify as heterosexual to have sexual encounters of various kinds with other men. Ward's research highlights the fact that sexual identity, sexual behavior, and sexual attraction can vary over time and often depend on the specific situation in which people find themselves, such as whether or not they are in a relationship, whether they live in an environment where same-sex relationships are discriminated against, and so on. We need a theory of sexuality that encompasses all human experience. Canadian researcher Sari Van Anders has proposed a new theory of sexuality that encompasses all human experience. According to her theory, solo sexuality is an erotic act that we engage in for ourselves, such as masturbation, but it also includes the wider sensual experiences we have for our own pleasure. Cooking a good meal, for instance, can be part of a broader erotic experience for some people, as can dancing, singing, playing an instrument, and so on. Partnered sexuality, on the other hand, is an erotic act performed by one person on one or more other people. Once again, the spectrum of couple experiences varies greatly, but the common denominator is the feeling of pleasure, connection, and excitement, which can lead to orgasm. Then there is asexuality, which is when a person does not experience any particular erotic desire or arousal. Asexuality can manifest in a number of ways, none of which are right or wrong, such as the desire to masturbate but not to have sex with another person. Then there is non-romanticism, which Van Anders describes as being sexually attracted to someone but not having romantic feelings towards them. Ecosexuality, or sex ecology, is when someone experiences a deep sexual connection with the earth and has deep erotic experiences with natural elements including water, mud, or trees. Ecosexuality is often associated with art and environmental activism and also involves spirituality and deep nurturing practices. Our sexuality is also expressed through the role we play in a relationship. It is based on a power dynamic and can be active or passive, so we might give or receive, decide or have things decided for us. Sometimes these roles are formalized in specific practices, such as BDSM, which stands for bondage, domination, discipline, submission, sadism, and masochism. A further binary distinction is made between people who are single and those who are in a relationship. It is typically assumed that being in a relationship is better than being single, and people often describe being alone as their worst nightmare. In the worst-case scenario, this leads people to enter into bad relationships simply because they are scared of being alone. Just as the binary view of sex and gender prevents us from seeing all the nuances on the entire spectrum, this view also overlooks the many cases in which people are neither alone nor in a couple. Removing this binomial mindset makes it easier to recognize and respect all other types of relationships, none of which are wrong. There is only one type of sexual relationship that is considered normal in our society. Another harmful binary prejudice when it comes to sex and sexuality is normal versus abnormal. In other words, what is acceptable and what is not. When we draw this line, we are saying that there is a correct way to have sex, which is natural and right, and another way which is wrong or even dangerous. In the list of sexual dysfunctions in psychiatric manuals, such as the Standard Classification of Mental Disorders DSM-5, the only kind of sex to be acknowledged as normal is penis-vagina intercourse that ends in orgasm. Many people argue that this type of intercourse is the most natural because it is also how animals reproduce. Yet this fails to take into account same-sex relations, mutual masturbation, oral sex, or indeed other types of sexual relations that are common and widespread in the animal world. Western society also considers monogamy to be the only ethical kind of relationship, but this is once again nothing more than a convention, a view shared by only one part of the world and imposed as if it were the only possible scenario. Anyone who prefers other kinds of sexual relationships, therefore, often feels out of place, and this distinction between right and wrong creates a sense of guilt and shame about any desires or fantasies that do not conform to penis-vagina intercourse. It also leads to feelings of frustration and dissatisfaction among all the people who get no pleasure or not enough pleasure from penis-vagina sex. Gail Rubin, an author who has been studying this issue for some time, suggests that we should not judge a sexual relationship by whether or not it conforms to current convention, but by whether it is consensual and then by how pleasurable or satisfying it is for the people involved. There are many kinds of intimacy. It might be something that we cherish and only share with the people closest to us, or else it might be something we keep to ourselves, something that we share with others, or something that we share with the whole world. There is physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, familial intimacy, and sexual intimacy. We can only achieve true intimacy if we take care of ourselves and accept the idea that we are interdependent. This does not mean, however, that we should expect other people to provide for our needs, because we need to be able to take care of ourselves in order to have a satisfying relationship with others. American writer and educator Mia Mingus has also identified another type of intimacy called access intimacy, which is common among disabled or marginalized people who need the help of others. We have to stop assuming that sexuality and gender are binary. Cisgender is a term used to describe people whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth, while transgender people do not identify with their assigned gender. Non-binary is an umbrella term that encompasses all expressions of a person's gender that do not fit into the binary male or female category. It is commonly believed that sex and gender are binary, and more specifically that sex is linked to a person's biological traits, while gender is a purely cultural, social, and historical construct. This belief first arose as a result of ideas expressed by Plato, which were later adopted by Christianity, whereby gender is only male or female and depends on the genitalia a person is born with. Intersexuality, however, challenges this belief and represents all people who were born with a sexual and/or reproductive anatomy that does not fit within male-female sexual dimorphism. It should be noted, however, that many of these people underwent major surgery as children to fit into the male-female category. Today, the situation is gradually changing, and there are several movements that offer support to the intersexual community. Gender is a complex blend of biological, social, and psychological factors, and includes gender identity, which is a person's deep sense of who they are. Gender roles, which determine how people interact with others based on gender norms and rules. Gender expression, which is how a person dresses, does their hair, and generally expresses their gender. And the gender experience, which is how someone experiences the world in relation to their gender. All of this is then also closely connected to a person's other identity categories, including ethnicity, race, disability, sexuality, indigenous or non-indigenous status, class, age, nationality, religion, and so on. Intersectionality can, to a certain extent, help simplify complex binary issues. Intersectionality is a term used to describe how different aspects of our individual identities work together to shape our experiences. It is also linked to the way in which the power systems of our society influence us through privilege and oppression. The term originated with the African American feminist movement in the late 1980s in order to recognize and define the experiences of African American women in the US justice system and how they differed from those of white women. At the time, the feminist movement was dominated by white Anglo-American voices, and African American women were struggling to be heard. Intersectionality can help us determine where we stand in terms of the different cultural binary categories that are inherent to our identities, such as male or female, gay or straight, white or black, disabled or non-disabled, transgender or cisgender, rich or poor, young or old, and so on. It is especially helpful in understanding how our opinions on binary categories determine our own level of power and privilege. Being a white, middle-class trans woman, for example, is very different from being a working-class trans woman of color. This affects many different areas of life, from accessing healthcare on the one hand to experiencing violence on the other. And that brings us to the end of our summary of Life Isn't Binary. If you are interested in learning more about any of the issues or initiatives mentioned above, why not read the book? Meanwhile, let's look at a selection of the book's most interesting quotes. Inviting you to consider life from a non-binary perspective is about shifting our framework away from a rigid either-or perspective towards both and possibilities, which embrace paradox and uncertainty. The gender binary is culturally specific and, like the sexuality binary, related to the settler-colonial, imperialistic project of categorizing different groups of people and bodies as superior or inferior to each other. It's also rooted in a capitalist system which required femininity to be opposed to masculinity in various ways in order to justify women's unpaid labor within the home, caring for the current workforce and raising the next one, or particularly in the case of women of color, serving other people's families in these ways. Many of us have been binary thinking our whole life, so it's not an easy thing to stop doing, and we need to go gently on ourselves, remembering that judging ourselves as good or bad on the basis of how much we are binary thinking is yet another binary. Finally, before signing off, we will leave you with the key takeaway from the book. Having a binary mindset is normal, but we can break free from this pattern and make life more enjoyable for everyone. Basing our way of thinking on a binary system is detrimental because it does not allow us to fully appreciate the infinite nuances of the world we live in. This binary thinking is most evident when we talk about sexuality. Sex and gender are not part of the same binary pair, they are two separate entities. Recognizing these differences allows us to explore our own sexuality more freely, even if it is not what society tells us is acceptable. We are all capable of changing our mindsets, but it requires patience, perseverance, and self-love. Once we learn to accept ourselves as we are, we will no longer feel the need to fit into binary boxes, and we will stop expecting other people to do the same.